On the show today, we have Danielle Smeltzer, and here is why she is awesome. She's the founder, CEO, and Chief Capacity Officer of Awarely Embodied Leadership, Inc., challenging organizations to consider more sustainable paths to growth through trauma-informed coaching, workshops, and disruptive thought leadership. I do love a disruption. Over the last 16 plus years, she's been a founder, consultant, thought leader, and strategic partner for CEOs, founders, and leadership teams to help organizations grow more sustainably while navigating change. My God, we all need that. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into, well, what we kind of mentioned in the bio there, which is the trauma informedness of it all, super curious about that. We have to dig into your past first, which with the first question I always ask my guests, what is your best or worst employee experience?
Yeah, I had a hard time with these because I think all of them are a little bit bittersweet. I mean, that's a good part and a bad part to all of them. But the best I would say is, especially as a woman working in male-dominated industries, which is my history, is men saying my name in rooms that I'm not in to help me grow my career. And I've had an incredible capacity for that over my tenure of people who have stood up for me and opened doors that I couldn't have opened. And so I'm super grateful for that.
How did you find out about it? That's always what I find interesting is your name gets brought up and you're like, oh, that's nice. What did they say?
Yeah, these ones were very clearly indicative that something had been said by a promotion or a new opportunity that came up, and ones that were quite surprising too, of opportunities that I maybe didn't think I was ready for, but they're like, nope, you got this. Here you go.
So one more question to that. I always find it interesting because it really depends on the caliber of leader when it comes to that. Because, and I was just talking about this recently with a friend of mine, when we do these, I guess, reviews, yearly reviews or whatever, however frequently you do them. And they always ask you like, what's your 5-year plan? I always want to turn around and go, what's your 5-year plan for me? Because at the end of the day, you have a bigger idea of what opportunities are out there, but I don't know because you have a more strategic lens being further up the chain. So in this case, what did you do as an employee to better prepare those leaders to be informed to bring up your name? Did you have to sell yourself? Were they overly attentive and paying attention? I'm just trying to understand what your role was in it.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on in my career, I think it was a lot of just showing up and saying yes to everything and being highly adaptive and having a ton of energy. This was before I had a lot of like clarity and exactly where I wanted to go. And so they were seeing paths for me, just as you said, and seeing opportunities for me that weren't even presented publicly. It was like, there's this major change happening in this organization and so is leaving, or a founder is leaving, or a partner of a founder is filling a gap and can no longer do that as an organization scales. And so it was being there and doing the work, and then the opportunities arising.
The reason I dug into that a little bit more is because you'll hear work speaks for itself. And that's not always the case because you're relying on a leader being good and great to paying attention to your work. So it's an interesting sort of balance of how much do I sell myself so that they have that information to speak in the room, or how much do I rely on them to be a great leader that pays attention, knows my worth, sees my value, and connects it to the opportunities that are out there. Yeah, it's a tough call. Oh, we have to get into your topic because I'm super curious about, and I know we dug into this in our pre-conversation. So my brain was firing and I'm like, oh, I have to wait for this. I have to wait for the conversation. So let's start off first with usually what I do with every episode, which is definitions.
Yeah.
I need to really make sure we're on the same song sheet because we don't define anything in the leadership space. So I hate starting a conversation without doing so. How would you, or how do you define trauma-informed leadership?
I'm so glad you're asking this. And I did my prep work. I listened to a bunch of episodes today and I was like, oh, he's going to ask me that. So I was trying to distill it down for myself and for you. So trauma-informed leadership for me it's a practice. So it is a practice of building awareness so that you can lead with balancing empathy and accountability. With trauma-informed leadership, we're often thinking of the outward perception of making sure we make people feel safe and supported and involved in things like that. But really, my stance on it is taking accountability as a leader for our own behaviors, our own stress response patterns, and really how we show up. but also acknowledging that there's context around us of what happens in other people's lives that they bring into the workplace. So it's like this constant conflict and clash of my history, someone else's history, and then our role as a leader is being aware of that place in between.
So the trauma informed piece, to me, it feels like you're just always assuming people are going through a hard time, or yourself as a trauma informed leader, because the first relationship you should have is with yourself, obviously. So that trauma informedness, is that how you enter it when you come to those relationships and building connection? Is that you're assuming not everything's perfect?
Yeah, it's assuming that essentially everyone's coming with their own lived and learned experiences into the workplace, whether, and I know you've talked about this on your episodes, whether it's their cultural upbringing or their socialization or something terrible that happened to them in their life. And the definitions of trauma has changed a lot. And I think that's part of the work that I do is also shifting that understanding of what that is. So in the past, we used to think of things like PTSD. You're in war, you're in this major conflict, there's this incredible exposure to something terrible. Now we know from so much more research on neuroscience and neurophysiology and what actually happens in our bodies is it's actually can be something pretty small. So it can be something that's too much too fast, too little too late, or just anything that puts our body out of whack and unable to process and experience the world in the way that our regulated system is supposed to work. And so essentially it's a disruption of how we experience the world. And if you think about the workplace, it's like constant disruption between people, process systems, whatever is happening. And so we're just these nervous systems really just going like ding, 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 all over the place when we're working. And so when we can start to understand and appreciate that, we're connecting that brain body experience as like a whole of a person as a leader.
How do you differentiate it with all the other, and I'm going to sound like a jerk here,
Yeah.
buzzy forms of leadership?
Yeah.
I.e., I'm a servant leadership. I'm a human-centric
Totally.
leadership. Is it another style? Is it an intention? Like, how do you align that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's certainly why I say it's a practice. So the awareness for me is a lot of the leadership training that I did historically, and I did a lot of different courses and things like that. And it was always about cognitive awareness, which is great. We learn something, we do something, but we forget about why we react and respond in different ways in situations and also how other people react and respond. And so that's where I was like, I want to go deeper in understanding why I actually do the things that I do. And so that's where trauma informed takes into consideration the brain, the body, as well as the heart. And by heart, I mean values, beliefs, things that guide us more as who we are. And when I say body, I mean sensations and everything that happens within our nervous system that actually informs a lot of the way we behave and act.
If you're introducing this with new leaders, do you feel that there's some resistance based on generations? And I'll say this in the sense that if you came at me and said,
Yeah.
I'm going to teach you trauma-informed leadership.
Yeah.
Great. I don't have any trauma. What trauma are you talking about? My team's great. They're fantastic. Where's trauma in this? What's the challenges? That's just a blocker or a challenge to overcome. It's not trauma. It just feels like it might be a word that can rub people the wrong way.
Totally. And so that's actually why the name of my company is Embodied Leadership, not Trauma Informed Leadership. And so embodiment is like taking into consideration that we all have bodies. We all experience the world, not just in our brain, but also in our body. And so part of my work is redefining what trauma is. And as I said, lots of people think of it as like a big event. But it's also acknowledging that not every traumatic event actually results in trauma. And that most of the work that I'm talking about is actually how do we renegotiate our relationship with stress? And because essentially what trauma is stress that impacts the body and isn't processed and then gets stuck. And that's where we have physical symptoms and manifestations of burnout and things like that. So I'm kind of like taking it back a few levels of trauma is like the worst thing that can happen. Most of the time, a lot of us are experiencing it as stress, and everyone can relate to stress. So that's kind of where I have that entry point of like, you're a leader, you're probably experiencing stress.
I like that you approach it as a practice. And the reason is because there are, and I hate when leaders do this, they go, I have a leadership style. I'm like, great, then you're a horrible leader because you have to have different styles. Not one style works for everybody. Command and control actually does work in certain situations, but also empathetic leadership. This feels like no matter which type of leader you need to be in a certain situation, like an emergency, command and control is really necessary in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
But then having this as a practice on top of that, I find that it's not a hat on a hat. It is actually useful. It is actually something that can be connected regardless of the Swiss Army knife of leadership you're using in that way. Because
Mm-hmm.
as a communications guy, I'm always, okay, but what did they need? How did they understand what we're trying to do? As opposed to me, it's understanding the trauma, the backstory, and then adapting the leadership style based on that. So I see it working interlocked ish.
Yeah, it's really like a foundational model
Hmm.
of me as a person, as a leader. My belief is that I need to take accountability for my emotions, my behavior, the context that impacts me going into the workplace, even before I'm interacting or supporting other people. That's my first responsibility, is knowing what sets me off, what drives me, and what causes me
Huge.
to act the way that I do. And yeah, absolutely. I call myself like a chameleon because this is my foundation. This is what keeps me like generally grounded in this context of embodied leadership, trauma informed practices. But then I'm adapting to whatever's happening in that situation. And just like you said, if there's a major fire, like a crisis that needs to happen, I'll pull in other parts of my skill set and background. And one of the big misnomers, I think, with trauma informed leadership, like you said, of men or other people thinking like, why don't you do this? It sounds fluffy, is it's not an excuse for behavior. It's okay, cool. Everyone comes with their history, and certain people might react and respond in different ways that sometimes may be inappropriate or maybe inflated more than it needs to be. My job is to like understand that there might be something behind that, but also then have the conversation about what's happening. And so it gives me that pause to go, okay, this person's reacting in a way that maybe is a little bit off. I can acknowledge that, but then also go, what's happening? And let's figure this out and let's dig into it.
I want to connect some dots here between embodied leadership, trauma, but also characteristics. So if
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out whether I am already or I want to lean into the characteristics that would be this type of leader, what are we looking at? What are we pointing to?
Yeah, and I should acknowledge that certainly in different practices and different leaders, they may have different names for this. This is just my scope of practice because it's a passion of mine and what I generally call it. But it's really coming down to that awareness. So, do I have a general understanding of my stress response patterns, my emotional behavior, how I show up in the world, and am I taking that space and time to intentionally respond instead of react? And so that's kind of like the baseline, right? Do I have a general sense of where I'm at? Do I know where I tend to stay within my nervous system state? Am I like always wired up here, or I'm always in shutdown? And so when you have that understanding of your baseline, like that's generally where we start.
Do we, that feels like not a work thing though. That feels like a life thing.
Yeah.
So are we doing this at, so for instance, I can see that, but I'm also maybe in a home situation and my
Mm-hmm.
partner is driving me nuts. And I'm like, I'm angry. Why am I angry?
Yeah.
Why is that the reaction that I
Yeah.
had? I don't think
Yeah.
it needs to be in the workplace for us to start paying attention to those triggers.
No. Yeah. So the reason I started doing this work and bring it into the workplace, and certainly a lot of the training I've done is definitely designed more for a clinical setting. And what I saw was there's too much of a definition and a polarization of what was work
Mm.
in life. And I think we all experienced this during the pandemic, where suddenly we're working with our babies on our lap and our dogs in the background and our, partner working from a table next to us. And suddenly we realize that our work and lives are really in this blended state more than ever. And that's kind of my conversation around work-life balance, is we expect people to shift the way they act, the way they respond, their stress levels shifting between home and work. My argument is that's not realistic. From the work that I do from like the nervous system perspective, you can't suddenly tell your system to go, this is a place we should be stressed and this is a place we shouldn't be stressed. And so my whole approach is, can we use these skills to move between all these spaces in our lives with greater ease? And so this is this whole like capacity building, and so that we're much more flexible and adaptable to everything that's happening in our lives, because sometimes, as you said, it all comes together as well.
What are we doing to sharpen these skills? Because there's a lot of people do not have self-awareness. And yet
Yeah.
they understand that this is an important thing. If they want to be
Yeah.
a great leader, they have to understand this.
Yeah.
So what are you telling people that you're like, you know what you should be doing a little bit more of?
Yeah, so it starts with that very like fundamental understanding that the way we think and the way we behave is not just directed by our brains, that we have bodies that interpret the world in a very different way. And so I start at the very basic levels of teaching people the language of the body. So a lot of that is in through sensations, imagery, the way we move, the way we behave, the way we act, and the way that we put meaning towards things. It's called, the model I use is called SciBAM. It's part of the work I do in somatic experiencing, which is the foundational education I have in this. And that's all basically the language, learning the language of the body, which then connects us more into the brain. So I work with people on those kind of really foundational skills of developing that understanding, because the language of the brain and the language of the body are quite different.
I love that you brought up the senses because I've been doing the show for a while. I've been a leader for a long time, and it's
Mm-hmm.
always focused on cerebral. It's why
Yeah.
do I think what I'm thinking? Why do
Yeah.
I? Well, that was a weird reaction to it,
Yeah.
and I don't think, and I love that you mentioned it, that we spend enough time going, does my temperature go up? Do I feel
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable in
Yeah.
my clothes?
Yeah.
Should I be sitting somewhere else? How does my spatially, what is that communicating as
Mm-hmm.
well to others and to myself? I don't think we go down that path enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the language piece is a big part of where I start, but then it's also understanding that everyone's baseline is different, and some of us may need some additional support to build capacity to move with more ease in all these spaces of our lives. And that's part of that foundational piece of trauma informed practices and embodied leadership. And so it's simple things like right now, like I am orienting to my space behind me. There's a very intentional reason that I have these colors and these flowers that I grew myself and dried and put in this vase that I bought from a local potter. Because as I'm in these conversations and I'm talking about trauma, which can be challenging, I can orient to these things that bring me ease in my nervous system. And so those are the types of things I start to teach people about, of how do you integrate that into very simple ways within your work and your life, of bringing in these moments of ease and these resources essentially, so that you can move back and forth between these moments of conflict and challenge and stress, and move back and forth with ease and calm, and giving your nervous system a break so that you can be more present and engaged and have these types of conversations.
All right, I'm going to throw the title of the podcast at you. Relationships.
Yeah.
How does this inform the relationships with our teams, our colleagues, our
Yeah.
leadership? We're focused so much on ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
understanding. So what's the benefit? Or yeah, I assume it's positive, so I'm going with benefit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's that relationship?
Yeah, so there's this really cool thing that happens within our bodies that we don't even know happens every day. Well, actually, we do. We've all been in toxic workplaces where there's that one person where you're like, this person can affect the entire room, change an entire environment. And like, we know this to be true. But when you look at it from actually what's happening physiologically, it's that our nervous systems are communicating with ourselves. And so you can hypothesize that some of those leaders may be in a place where they are not regulated. Their nervous systems are just like in this constant state of flight or flight. And that actually affects people around us. So this is called co-regulation. Sometimes it works in a positive way, sometimes it doesn't. And so my part of trying to work towards this practice of awareness is that anytime we're in a space with someone else, even you and I in this container of a video, we are playing off each other's nervous systems. And so part of our role and accountability as a leader is, what impact and influence do we want to have? Some people maybe don't care, and they're like, I want to rule through fear and command and control.
Mhm.
Maybe that's their style. For me, I find if I can invite that stillness and that joy and that space for connection, that's really where I can allow people to explore who they are, develop their own skills, and in that space. And those are some of the baseline things that we need for these big buzzwords we talk about of psychological safety and diversity, equity, inclusion. These are the basic conditions that we need to have before we can go into that big work.
And to your point, how does diversity impact this? Because
Yeah,
how I show up and how I understand how I show up
yeah,
can be received very differently based on
totally.
somebody's background,
Yeah.
socioeconomic, cultural, tons of different factors. But I don't have any control over that. I only have control over me. So
Mhm.
how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we do a lot of cross-sectional understanding of that in my training too, of acknowledging that everyone has different ways of learning, different beliefs, different cultural things. And ultimately it's acknowledging that yes, that is all true, but we also all have nervous systems. And so like in my work, I'm acknowledging that those things are there, but I'm focused more on the nervous system connection. So if I am providing safety in my system that's lending to someone else who may feel unsafe because of maybe cultural challenges or disconnect or bias or whatever, that's like my baseline responsibility is providing safety for them to start to feel safer in that space. And so that's like the baseline starting place.
So what are people getting wrong with this? Because again, like I sort of mentioned before, trauma induced sounds scary. It sounds
Yeah.
sad. It sounds like a lot of baggage. What are people getting in the way of this being useful for them?
Yeah, I think going back to the conversation we had about acknowledging that the definition of trauma has changed. So it's basically anything that affects our innate ability to move in a regulated state between stressors and deactivation. And so when we can acknowledge that it's just part of a human experience, that's really great to do. And it's not always a big story. That's the other part of it is we don't need to know anyone's story. We don't need to know what happened to them. We don't need to know the specifics at all. It's just acknowledging that through our lives, there are things that impact the way that we react and respond to things, and we all bring that with us. The last part is that there can't be accountability when you're trauma informed. And this is certainly something I'm continuing to work on is balancing, coming from an empathetic, grounded state of meeting people where they're at, but also that behavior is not excused, even with context being present of stressors or trauma that's impacted them. And so I think that's part with accountability is acknowledging things impact how we behave, but it's not an excuse for poor behavior in the workplace.
Uh, you're speaking my language. I have a big problem with leadership in that they never are generally accountable. They're really
Yeah.
good at responsible, but accountable is this. But what if they're actually bad leaders? We're not holding them to any sort of
Yeah.
standard. So to
Yeah.
have trauma informed understanding that even if somebody's going through things, we still have to be accountable for how we show up, how we
Yeah.
work, how we connect with others. How do we encourage this type of leadership? If this is what we need to be focusing a lot more on in how we show up and how we connect, how do we raw cheerlead this, Danielle?
Yeah. I think it's dismantling a lot of these like larger conversations of expectations around leadership, like getting away from this command and control model. It's also going away from glamorizing burnout and stress. I think we celebrate the rise from burnout as opposed to proactively mitigating it. And so that's a lot of what the work I do is trying to change the narrative along with our relationship to stress. Like we think that stress is bad and terrible and this thing we need to avoid, but I'm actually trying to encourage people to look at stress as something that can sometimes actually serve them. And stress isn't something we need to be scared of. It's just when we get stuck in an activated state or when we lack awareness of how it impacts us on a longer term basis. And so that's a lot of the shift of culturally that I'm trying to have these conversations with of we're so scared of all these things. Let's bring them out into the open and have greater conversations about them because that's the only way we're going to change actually how workplaces engage in these relationships with people.
I want to dig a little deeper into that particular topic of stress because as soon as we
Mm-hmm.
talk about stress, we're talking about burnout. It seems to be
Yeah.
in the next sentence, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then there'll be others going, no, it's good stress. It's
Yeah.
motivational. It's inspiring.
Yeah.
How do you balance the two?
Yeah. So that a lot of that comes down to the awareness. The first thing is acknowledging not all stress is bad. It's been very demonized. And I'll be the first to say I've certainly been in that space before of trying to avoid stress or eliminate it, which really just gets us into more stress because as leaders, that's just not possible. We're constantly going to have things thrown at us, situations we have to deal with. So my stance is Okay, let's start to differentiate between good stress and bad stress. And this evolves depending on how much capacity we have, like how much exposure to stressors we've had on a long-term basis. But it's really starting to understand, like, we call it a window of tolerance. And so all of us have within our nervous systems this space that we can move between stressors of an activation and a deactivation. And naturally, we're meant to just move back and forth. But if we're like, the pandemic is a great example. We were in a prolonged state of stress for 2-3 years. None of us are meant to go through that. So that could be defined as bad stress. Good stress is, I literally have to finish this project by 5 p.m. on a Friday. So I'm putting in 12-hour days for 3 days and I'm just going to do it. Great. I'm doing a presentation. I need to speak a little bit louder, bring up more energy because I have to engage this room of 400 people that need to just be tuned in. Those are all examples of good stress. Bad stress is essentially when we get stuck in activated state and that starts to deplete us. It's really hard for our nervous system to maintain that amount of energy. It is really tiring. And so that's when you'll have the 3 a.m. wake ups and like just the general malaise, and I'm just exhausted and depleted. And so the qualities are very different. And I think that's the thing, is like the quality is different between good stress and bad stress.
Do we need to understand this better from a cultural standpoint? I ask that because we don't generally hire for this. This is not something we go, oh, I have 5 questions I need to ask, and one of them is about self and trauma-informed leadership. We look at it as something maybe after the fact, not proactively. Can organizations do that?
I don't know if it necessarily has to be explicitly like, are you trauma informed? Are you an embodied leader? Those are certainly languages that I'm using to, well, really disrupt a space that needs to be talked about. But I think it comes down to that awareness piece. I don't differentiate really between personal development and professional development anymore. I would expect that any leader is doing both. And I would encourage people to be like over indexing in personal development at this point as well, because that's typically where you're getting into like the underlying root causes of why you are the way you are and your values, and it's that bigger picture piece. So those are the questions I would encourage organizations to be asking, of the deeper questions of who you are as a leader, how do you build awareness, like how are you handling stress and what do you do with stress, and how you're also creating that balanced and grounded perspective for people around you too, because that's a big part of it, is we affect the people around us.
Do you feel organizations, leadership, HR have any role to play in perpetuating or supporting this type of leadership? Because it's a lot on you.
Yeah.
It's a lot on you,
Yeah.
right? It's a lot about you figure this out. You know yourself, right? But we're not living on an island here.
And I have this debate often of like, whose responsibility is it to fix this really big problem we have with stress and burnout right now? And I go back and forth on it. Sometimes it's the accountability of the individual. Sometimes it's the organization. I think it really has to be both, working hand in hand. And at the end of the day, organizations are people. So it really does come down to CEOs, founders, other people leading by example. I hope that we're getting to this place where we're realizing that the way we've been working just isn't sustainable. I mean, we're seeing it in all the stats, even in the Stats Canada statistics. I did an article on that recently, and it's the people talking about burnout and like how stressed out they are at work is just going through the roof. And then we have productivity issues and all of this stuff that, like, I think the stats are starting to actually show themselves in different way. The data is there. So I hope that certain leaders can maybe start to see that connection to ROI, because some of them need that, but also maybe just because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, but I mean, if we actually did the right thing we needed to do, that would be a much different world we live in, Danielle.
It sure would. I sure would.
Working with your clients, working with CEOs and leadership, can you think of any like real aha moments where you were walking them through this to really sort of shift their thinking and they're like, oh, right, this is what I need to be doing now moving forward?
Yeah. So and it's interesting. One of my biggest challenges for me personally is my knowledge is like my greatest barrier as well as my greatest thing. So I have to talk about this in language that people understand. So it's like, how do you want to feel? What impact do you want to have on the world? And how do you want to show up and support your team members, and how you connecting people with purpose. So I use a lot of language that corporations and business leaders understand. And then once they're like, okay, like I get that, then I go deeper into the why behind it. And that's when I start to explain what's actually happening in the nervous system and equipping them with more of the understanding of neuroscience. But it really starts with the basic things of what are you trying to achieve and how are you trying to get there and what's getting in your way. And then I'm breaking it down. And this work that I do, I'm also like realistic that I'm balancing it with strategy. Like my background is operations and HR, and I can speak the language of strategic planning and financial budgets and things like that. So I always acknowledge that the two go hand in hand as well.
I love the fact that you have to speak corporate speak and almost dehumanize the topic to get to the human part of the topic.
Yeah.
Oh, that breaks my heart.
It's been my greatest challenge, the translation into what it actually means for people. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, as a communications nerd myself, it's really understanding, okay, but what's going to resonate with you? What story do I need to tell for you to go, oh, this is relatable to me?
Yeah. Yeah. And the stress and burnout is definitely the biggest one. Even though that's such a hot button topic, that's the one that people relate to. Everyone has experienced some form of stress, hopefully not burnout, but no one's immune to it essentially right now.
We seem to have gotten on a bit of a roller coaster since COVID. It was the pendulum swaying one way before COVID, then it swang all the way to the other end. And now it's sort of balancing itself out to some degree. How has it changed for you in the interest and understanding of this?
Yeah, it's good and bad, I think. There's certainly a lot more acknowledgement and understanding that we need to think about our relationship with stress. We generally know that burnout isn't good, but there's also a lot of fake experts, and there's a lot of promises out there. Like trauma-informed work is not a done in practice. You don't go to a course and then suddenly you're a trauma-informed leader. That's not how it works. Also, people aren't going to resolve their issues with stress or trauma overnight. It's not like do these 5 steps and I'm suddenly regulated and I'll never have stress again. That's not the reality. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is just be realistic about it. Of let's build awareness, let's build tools, but also being human in this experience that we're always going to be working in these challenging situations, and these things are going to cause us to question what we're doing and how we behave. And I think that's the biggest thing is there is no magic solution. We're always going to be working at this in one way, shape, or form. And so that's what bothers me a lot about some of the language out there is there's a lot of promises that are not realistic.
5 minutes a day, Danielle, it'll all be fixed.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're forgetting in a lot of those places is like a lot of people who've never stopped their entire career, telling them to sit and meditate for 5 minutes, their system will literally panic and feel like that's unsafe, because that is unsafe within the context of the system that they've been operating in. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do before we can even get to the space of someone being able to safely and accessibly meditate for 5 minutes, which is not what the internet wants you to believe.
No, of course not. We can clickbait in 5 minutes and find 5 things we can do right now, Danielle, to fix our burnout. Yeah.
And that's not the reality. And I'll never make those promises. And if I do, please tell me.
So then I have to ask the question about regulation, because I know for me, if I'm in a stressful or anxious moment, I need a few minutes. But I also have a partner that might need an hour of just putting a podcast on or music or something. So as much as we talk about, well, your 5 minutes a day aren't going to fix you, there are things that help each of us to sort of explore. So how do you find what might work for you? Because some people are doing none of this and just redlining every day in going through life. So where do you start to go down that path?
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge I was like that too. I did that for years and years and years and ended up with chronic pain and chronic illness, and now we're working backwards. It took me a long time to start. As my counselor would say, it took me 5 years for my nervous system to be even in the room with me of doing deep work. So I think that's just really good for people to acknowledge that this work takes time. And even just starting with the awareness and the intention to learn more and build more awareness is like a really just like a big place to start. But the biggest thing is learning about your own unique nervous system. We're not making any changes at first. It's just understanding what is your baseline place. Like you said, I need this much space to come back into a state of regulation after a stressor. And that's fine. It's just acknowledging that we have different tendencies. Like for me, it was, I spent 20 years of my life basically stuck in an activated state, whereas some people may have spent the last 10 years of their life in a shutdown state.
Right.
And that's where you start, is like, where am I right now, without judgment, just acknowledging and understanding what your predisposed conditions are.
And I'm just, for me, it's, I know so many people, even to get to that conversation is so hard, because they have to admit that they're in an active state all the time, because being in it and admitting it are two very different conversations.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big thing about this, is also starting to take away our labels of what is bad and good. And so being activated is not bad. Being shut down is not bad. It's that we put those labels as a society on these things, expecting people to be constantly in a state of regulation or calmness. And that's not the point. The point is to be able to have a reaction to something, notice it, and then be able to move back from it. And hopefully maybe not have as much blowouts or things like that. But we're not trying to demonize anything. Even anger is a really good example. Like, I didn't have access to anger for about 10 years of my life. And now I do, because it's safe to. And I know that it's a communication from my nervous system saying that something is out of alignment, as opposed to demonizing, I shouldn't be angry, when really that just gets stored in the body. And that's where we get stressed.
And I hope for leaders to really lean into their curiosity, because as much as we need to remove labels, that's how people understand things.
Totally.
And you're talking about nuance, and you're talking about context, which is not the world we live in. We want answers, we want simplicity, and we don't want the fuzzy edges and try to understand that. So I can see that being a huge challenge.
Yeah, you picked up on the great word there, is curiosity. And I'm in a 3-year program right now where I'm doing really deep, intense trauma work to learn and understand this on a really deep physiological level. But that's all they ask of us, is curiosity. Yeah. Just come with your curiosity to witness what your nervous system is doing. And that's the work we do.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here, Danielle. I really appreciate it, but I'm not letting you off the hook quite yet. I have one more question for you, which is, what is one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
Yeah, I think it's really what we just said, is starting to build that curiosity, to build the awareness of where you are at as a leader, what makes you react and respond. And that's that piece of, let's start taking some accountability as leaders, as opposed to, which we all like to say, blaming everything on organizations. Yes, they have a part to play in it, but at the start of the end of the day, we are people working with people, and the relationship with ourselves is how we have relationship with others.
That is Danielle Smeltzer. She is the founder, CEO, and Chief Capacity Officer for Embodied Leadership. These are new lips. Thank you so much for being here, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.